It's midnight in Myanmar, where the death toll from Cyclone Nargis is still officially 22,000. But new numbers are emerging that suggest a disaster far, far worse than that. The US Embassy in Myanmar now says, according to information it's receiving, over 100,000 people may have died, and that is just in the Irrawaddy Delta alone. That's where we'll begin this news hour, with the first pictures to emerge from that devastated region the moment Cyclone Nargis struck. Zaina Awad has our report.
It hit with deadly force. The people of Myanmar defenseless in the face of Cyclone Nargis. The government knew what was coming, but they failed to pass on the warnings of impending disaster. In just a matter of hours, destruction on a massive scale. Tens of thousands are dead. Millions who survived, bewildered and seeking shelter wherever they can find it. The few aid workers already on the ground totally overwhelmed. The limited medical supplies they do have are nowhere near enough. And it doesn't matter which road you take. Everywhere leads to yet more death and destruction. The first attempt to rebuild their lives, a matter of sticks and pieces of string. But the task is daunting. Almost every home has been totally destroyed. The people here say no aid is reaching them. But anyone watching state television sees a different version of events. Soldiers seen helping the most desperate across affected areas, a version of events that contradicts the reality in remote areas. But it's thought that only a fraction of the military is involved in the rescue operation. No government help is expected here anytime soon. But what may be coming, the outbreak of deadly disease, as rotting corpses contaminate the only water available. Zaina Awad, Aljazeera.
So as we keep saying, and as you saw there, the damage is severe and extensive right across the country. But let's put it into some numbers for you to get a clearer picture. The United Nations estimates before Cyclone Nargis struck, about 1.75 million people lived in the worst hit areas. Low-lying coastal areas like the Irrawaddy Delta, that suffered the brunt of the storm. Bogale, with a pre-storm population of 180,000, has been almost totally destroyed. At least 10,000 people died there alone. And the neighbouring towns of Phiapon, with 130,000 people, and Laputa, with 210,000, have also suffered major damage. Well, Al Jazeera has a correspondent on the ground in Myanmar who's visited the devastated Delta. We're not naming her for her own safety. She sent us this update.
We've just spent the last 24 hours in the cyclone-devastated region. We travelled for about 60 miles south of the former capital of Myanmar, Yangon, and we saw utter devastation and destruction. People are really suffering. We interviewed farmers, we interviewed ordinary village folk, and they tell us that no one has come to help them since the cyclone struck in the early hours of Saturday morning. Farmers growing rice, they've lost their entire crop. We saw factories that have been completely flattened. We visited a pottery factory. The owner of the factory has just lost 5 years' worth of income. We also visited a monastery where monks have lost their entire living quarters. They have no food and they have handicapped children to look after. And the very sad story here is that the village people can't give them any food because they have no food to eat themselves. We travelled for 6 hours yesterday and we didn't see any sign of government help, police or military. We saw international aid workers, but they were only assessing the situation. There is actually no international aid. There is no food and no shelter getting into these remote areas, and the situation is becoming more desperate by the minute. The government of Myanmar do not want foreign journalists in the country. We filmed a village of 300 people which is surrounded by water now, and miraculously no one lost their lives. And they told me that they had no prior warning about the cyclone. They showed me their transistor radio. They listened to state radio, and a couple of days before the cyclone hit, there was absolutely no mention on that radio station that there was a cyclone approaching Myanmar.
So for those who managed to survive the cyclone, now we turn to the surviving its aftermath. Let's have a look at these numbers for you. A lack of clean water is said to be the greatest problem. Many people are drinking coconut milk as a source of fluid, but coconuts are fast running out. Food is desperately short, even in cities relatively unaffected by the storm. Food prices are spiking. Tents, tarpaulins, they're both needed, with around 1 million people homeless, of course. 95% of homes have been destroyed in some areas. And a lack of fuel means trucks are struggling to deliver aid. People are using hand saws and axes to clear the trees blocking the roads. With more on the worldwide relief effort, here's Nazni Mashiri.
These are the latest international relief supplies about to head out from Singapore. Desperately needed tents, medical equipment as well as food and water. The Indian military also contributing to the effort, again carrying tons of emergency food and medicine. And in Thailand, more aid is on its way. The government's pledged to do as much as it can.
Tomorrow we plan to send 15 tons of medicine and more medical and relief supplies to help people there.
Those supplies are starting to arrive in Yangon, but the military regime is still not allowing in the workers that could help distribute them. For agencies in places like London, the priority is getting the aid to the most vulnerable.
Right now they need clean water, they need shelter, they need some food, and they need systems for sanitation. Those are the priorities now if we're going to stop losing any more people. Some people are clearly much more vulnerable, and you need to get help to the weakest and most vulnerable people first. And that's the hardest thing of all, is how to get help to those people.
The challenge of reaching those worst affected areas is immense. Tens of thousands of people are simply cut off from any help at all.
We know that there's been great disruption to shipping. The last I heard, the port of Yangon, for instance, is closed and is unable to receive shipments. So, you know, obviously, therefore, we have families who are stuck out on these islands.
Meanwhile, the pledges of aid from across the world continue to flood in. The United Kingdom's offered $10 million, the US $3 million, Canada is giving $2 million, and there's $1 million each from China and Indonesia. But agencies say far more is needed.
Teams are talking about bodies floating around in the water in the areas that they're going to get relief supplies to. You know, it's a huge problem.
France is offering much less, only $300,000. It's suspicious of the Myanmar's junta and has even suggested bypassing the regime and delivering help directly to the devastated areas. It's an idea that's currently being discussed at the United Nations. Nazni Mashiri, Aljazeera.
Well, the United Nations has, in the past few hours, held a media conference in New York on their attempts to bring relief to Myanmar. Let's go live to John Terrett. He's at UN headquarters for us in New York. John, what was said at that media conference?